The government has a long way to go to meet its promise to create 250,000 affordable daycare spaces by 2026. New numbers obtained by our colleagues at Radio-Canada show about 97,000 spaces have been created since 2021. That's just under 40% of the overall goal. That leaves 153,000 spaces at an average cost of $10 per day to go. So that's a big gap. They still got some time. It's not just the feds, it's also the provinces. That's the next topic here at the Power Panel. Michelle, if you look at the calendar, they still have time to get there. But what we're hearing from the big provinces in particular is they say the system doesn't work, but also you're hearing from the feds and other operators, the provinces aren't putting the cash in they were supposed to put into this system. And that's a big reason why there are problems on the training side, the staff side, and the payment side. What do you make of this?
Well, there's proof positive that this works. Look at Quebec. They've had this there for decades. So you know, the idea that provinces are trying to stand up and say, oh, this doesn't work, it's hard, no doubt. Recruiting is hard right now. Recreating the spaces is hard. And scaling up to the amount that the ambitious target that they set out, without question, was always going to be a challenge. But there are still 2 full years, practically 2 full years left to meet that target. Being 40% of the way there is is something to hold. And those families who are benefiting from those added spaces are sure glad that there's a federal Liberal government that brought in childcare. And so I think that this is something that they've got to keep working on. And this is their turn to put pressure on the provinces to say, you know, this is a popular thing. This is very supportive. This really helps women get back into the workforce. This really helps working families. This really helps people who are really having troubles with affordability right now. And so step up and be the partner that this is supposed to be about, that you signed those agreements about. It's not just something that they can dump at the doorstep of the feds. This is a partnership, and the feds have taken the lead, putting money behind it. And so I think that they are on course to be able to fulfill it. It will take time just to scale up.
So Jordan, on this, the feds have put about $30 billion on the table for this. And Jenna Sudds, who's the minister responsible for it now, says there's no more money. And in fact, the last time she was on the show, it was when Alberta was in the middle of its controversy. And she said, Alberta hasn't spent the money we've given them, and they're not putting their own money into it. What do we make of the fact that some of the provinces aren't living up to their end of this? Because the feds may wear this if it doesn't happen, and the problem may actually be in a provincial capital.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. This is a joint issue, right? So these agreements are federal provincial agreements, and they both need to come to the table to solve some of the sustainability issues that the programs are facing. But look, it's also a reality that there are certain political parties across the country who are not really supportive of the idea of this program, and so are perhaps not very enthusiastic about putting their own money into it. And I think that some of that accounts for a bit of the slowness that we're seeing in some of the larger provinces. And it's limited. If you're not topping up that money, there's only so much you can do, because of course one of the problems that the program is facing right now is that the money that's gone in, parent fees are now capped, and like, we benefit, we have our kids in one, it is great, it is life-changing. But if parent fees can't go up and the government money that they're putting in can't go up, well, the daycare's costs still go up.
Yeah, there's
right?
a huge there is a problem there.
That's right. So centers are now facing deficits, and we're actually in a situation where spaces could be shrinking rather than growing. So there is a real problem that the feds do need to come to the table with the provinces to find out a solution for that. And it's going to look different in each province because of the nature of the system. But the other piece of the puzzle is, of course, the workforce issue. You are not finding enough workers, and in large part that's because these jobs, even though they require higher education to become an ECE, an early childhood educator, oftentimes you're still finding postings and people are paid little more than minimum wage. So this is not a career that people are wanting to get into. We have to have a workforce strategy that actually makes this a desirable job and a sustainable way to support your family.
Yeah, and Cheryl, that's certainly the challenge in British Columbia, right? Like David Eby and his government totally on board with this, but those wages and the cost of living in, say, Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, and just having space to run a daycare center, these are some of the things they're running into. But in other cases, it's just not spending the money and maybe being a bit more ideologically opposed to this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it would, I don't know if it would make sense for the federal government to say, okay, we're willing to work with provinces that are willing to work with us on this. If we can say, kind of show us your work on this, for some of those provinces that have actually been investing the money, that have been doing the work, and they're saying, we're doing everything that we can, but we still cannot make these two pieces of the puzzle fit together, I think that would probably be a really good example to show other provinces who are at more of a stalemate and not, spending the necessary money and yet still, complaining and crying poor, that, we are willing to work with provinces, we are willing to work with you, but you have to do the same. Obviously, the problem is that leaves the families stuck in the middle. As always, it leaves the people who actually need the help holding the bag. They're the ones who now have to decide if they're going to leave the workforce entirely because they can't get the care. You have child care centers just shutting down outright, and people scrambling to find alternatives. That's not an ideal situation, and it's not going to appease anybody or cover anybody in glory in the eyes of the voters. And that's what they're going to remember. Did I have to leave my job because I can no longer get care? Because when this program started, obviously, the demand was going to go up. You have something that was for cheaper, of course, yeah, you're going to see a demand. And the fact that it seems like in some places they didn't quite prepare for that, and on the provincial level, it's a little problematic. But we see it time and time again. Whenever there is an issue of joint jurisdiction or something that is more provincial jurisdiction, we see it with healthcare. Yeah. The provinces are the first ones to throw their hands up and say, "Hey, this is the federal government's problem to solve."
Yeah, I don't know if the solution is a blend of subsidized spaces and unsubsidized spaces that are means tested and allocated based on ability to pay in same institutions or what they do. But Tim, they've got a revolt on climate. They've got not a failure to launch, but growing pains with the childcare plan while they're trying to roll out dental, while they're trying to roll out pharmacare. So it's like all these national programs requiring all of these focus, all with political stakes attached to them, all at the same time.
Yeah, Pierre Poilievre has found his heaven, if you will, the problems that the Liberals have. Look, and again, you can give them credit for being ambitious, but the reality with being ambitious in politics, which is something we should encourage, is more ambition in politics in all parties, is it's met with reality. And the reality is you just can't scale up as fast as you promised. Right. And when you make the promise, and I think, look, the Liberals rightly wore the jersey proudly of being the federal government that finally delivered daycare. They're going to wear more of the criticism despite the valid arguments about dual responsibilities with provinces. And I'm sure you and Jordan hear this, and I reference both you and Jordan as we all have children of a younger age. I hear as often about the cost of things as I do now about I can't find a space. I can't find a space. And as that enters the conversation more often, people are looking to point their finger and say, okay, didn't they promise? It's not even about $10 a day daycare. It's about I can't even find a space. And if you're trying to fight against that, Michelle's right. Look, great, they got 97,000 people, but 97,000 families, but spaces, they promised 250,000. If you're in that other 160,000 cohort, you aren't giving them applause. You're frustrated. So this is not one where, again, there's a quick fix. There's no magical promise or pixie dust Justin Trudeau can sprinkle and people will say, that's okay. Yep. They kind of just have to wear it and say, again, this is visionary. We did the hard things here. It's going to take time. But I don't think the public has the patience to accept that argument. So
Michelle, on that, I know they've said no more money, and they put the $30 billion on the table several years ago. But inflation ran really hot in the years between that, and fees got capped, at like a 2% growth prior to the massive increases in cost of living and in inflation. And these daycares, they've got to buy the food, they've got to pay the utility bills, and they got to pay the wages, and they're running into problems there. So do they need to reconsider that, or at least change the escalators? Because quite frankly, costs have changed substantially since these things were locked in.
Yeah, I think those are all things that they need to look at and in time. I think the biggest priority, though, is getting the provinces on board and actually putting in their share. Because if we want to see these spaces created, because I think that that's what I'm hearing most, is that we need the spaces, then they've got to make a priority for that. And so to do that, they've got to be able to recruit the people. And this goes, into our whole issue that right across the economy, there's still a lack of people for the jobs that we have to fill. And so, it's such, government's hard. Governing's hard. And when you're doing things, it's there's always going to be obstacles. Nothing comes easy. Bringing in a national program, that's why we haven't had one really since, healthcare back in whenever that was. But what I will say, though, is the absence of, Pierre Poilievre, sure, it might be his heaven because he's just flat against all of these things. Well, isn't that easy? But, I think that come election campaign, you're going to be asking for a little bit more. And particularly on childcare, he's been completely evasive and talking about some kind of a mixed system without ever putting any kind of specificity behind it, any targets behind it, nothing. And so, again, it's about the reality versus the alternative when it actually comes to the ballot box.
So Jordan, on that, I mean, I don't have explicit details on what the childcare policy of the Conservatives might be, but it seems more along the lines of money to parents. Parents have choice. You know what I mean? Rather than sort of building the subsidized spaces, which is, it is the Liberal view of building an institution versus the Conservative view of empowering individuals, right? So how does that play out, with these problems running hot in the background?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think it will play out well with parents who have these spaces or who are looking to get them. They want certainty. And I mean, look, large timescales, I get it. It took the Liberals 20 years from their first commitment to actually delivering on this program. So for sure, these things can take time. But it is really important, and it's important actually for the sustainability of the program, that the government actually go all the way to the finish line into making the program sustainable, to getting those sustainable agreements with the provinces so that it protects the program from cuts from future governments, right? Because a program that is seen to be not working well, not delivering the spaces that were promised, is a vulnerable program. So if they really believe in it, and I know there are many around the cabinet table and the Liberal team who do, they've got to get that to the finish line and protect it among voters and against potential cuts from the Conservatives.
Yeah, and Cheryl, that's a critical point, right? I mean, they passed legislation protecting this childcare program that would essentially force a future government to repeal legislation to do this. But locking in legislation is one thing. If the spaces and the capacity and the dollar amounts aren't locked in, you've got bigger problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are feeling those problems now, and they are going to feel that pain at the ballot box whenever we go to the polls next. So, they have to bring their kids with them to the ballot box to vote because they don't have a childcare space, as opposed to deliberately doing it.
We should have free childcare there as well.
But for all those, I mean, I don't have kids. I'm never going to have kids, so I don't, have a dog in the race, so to speak. But it is a matter of...
Child in the race. Come on. Now don't compare them.
What are you doing with your children?
Yeah, my God.
You know what I meant.
Yeah, teasing it.
But it is an issue for the entire country. It's an issue for the entire economy. Do you want people in the workforce? Do you want people being able to do what it is that they want with their lives? You do hear often a lot of the arguments, and it's something that, that Conservatives often play towards in terms of giving people that choice. They say, well, I raised my kids, I paid for my childcare, I did all these things, nobody ever helped me. I don't know if that's necessarily the right way forward, to carry on the struggle, but that's something I think that a lot of politicians are kind of counting on.
Yeah, I never had the polio vaccine. What do you need it? Tim, quick last thoughts to you.
So much to say, Cochran. Look, I haven't heard the Conservatives say they're going to tear it down. I think you have a number of Conservative premiers who were originally resistant, who accepted and did deals. I think, as Jordan is alluding to, as the system gets built, it's harder to step backwards. I think Pierre Poilievre smartly has been quiet on this because he recognizes that this isn't the Martin era, and this is not a shot against Michelle or Scott in the old days, beer and popcorn, when choice was more important. People want and need spaces. Conservatives know that.
Look, if you want to boost economic productivity, you've got to make it easier for women in particular to work. And Cheryl, kids are a wonderful blessing and a giant unfunded liability, as we're all finding out right now.
More than dogs, too. Way more than dogs.
All right, listen, thanks so much, gang. I want to thank the Power Panel, Michelle Cadario, Tim Powers, Sherelle Evelyn, and Jordan Likens. Thanks so much, gang. Amy O'Neill is the Executive Director of Treetop Children's Centre in Ottawa. Amy, it's good to meet you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, David.
You saw the numbers there. You see the gap in the number of spaces needed for the childcare plan to hit that goal. Well, how is it working for you? How many spaces have you created so far since opting into the $10 a day program?
So we opted into the $10 a day program right away. in 2022. And since then, we've created 19 preschool spaces, but it's not nearly enough. Even with a total of 43 preschoolers, we still have a waiting list of over 200 children.
Over 200. You created just under 20 spots and there's 200 more to come in. How does that compare to before the $10 a day program? Is that a surge in your wait list or is that consistent?
Oh, it's absolutely a surge. I mean, before we opted into the $10 a day program, it was very difficult for families to afford quality childcare in the GTA, which is where I'm located. So it was very difficult for families to afford childcare. So we didn't have nearly as high of a waiting list as we do now.
Right, because it just wasn't an option for people. So
Exactly.
it seems, from what you're seeing, it's at least in part hit the affordability target component, but the accessibility target component is the other issue. I mean, with the way the program is currently running, will you be able to expand the number of spots that you offer beyond the 19 extra for, say, next year?
Unfortunately, no, because we're located in a school. And right now in the TDSB school system, there are projects that are supposed to be underway, but they're currently underfunded by the provincial government. So the federal funding is there, but the provincial funding is not there, which is why, we're stalled right now with building space.
Okay, explain that to me. The provincial funding is not there because this is supposed to be a partnership between the two levels of government. I know it initiated and originated at the federal level, but we've heard this pushback from federal politicians in the Liberal government that provinces aren't stepping up with the cash. Is that they're not putting extra money in or not putting the expected money in from your perspective?
Well, Ontario, for example, has cut $85.5 million in 2024 to the childcare sector. That is money that was meant to be put into the CWELC, the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Program, but unfortunately they've cut that funding. The federal government, to my knowledge, has put in their fair share, but the problem is that they're not working together, the feds and the provinces, to come together and collaborate and come up with a funding formula that works for each individual municipality and jurisdiction.
Right. So, but is that on the federal government to do or is that on the provincial government to do? I wonder, Amy, because I don't think when they signed these agreements, the feds were expecting the provinces to take money out of the system, right? That was not the goal, right? So exactly. Where do you think the challenges lie?
It definitely needs to be put on the provincial government. I mean, when the funding guidelines came out in November of 2023, there was only a 2.1% cost escalation that was included in that. And as you're well aware, costs have skyrocketed, and yet fees have remained stagnant from 2022. So what that means is operators like myself are running into deficits and using our reserves to compensate for the loss of revenue from the province.
Okay, so that's obviously not sustainable, right? Because of the cap on costs of the inflationary cap in the increase in fees is not keeping up with demand. I've spoken to other operators on this show who complained that you start booking your costs at the first of the month, but you don't get reimbursed for the signing up for the $10 a day program from the government subsidy until the end of the month. And that creates cash flow challenges. But this deficit, I mean, how long can you keep operating if you don't get some sort of an escalator here?
Well, I mean, it's just not viable long term. I mean, for many nonprofit centers like myself who report to a board of directors, it will become a question of whether or not we can actually, whether or not it's a sustainable program. But the program is so valuable to children and families in Canada. I just can't reiterate that enough. It's so valuable. And yet I feel like the ball has dropped on, in particular in our situation in Ontario, with the province not coming up with its fair share of the funding.
We've heard from groups like the YMCA, which is not a political organization by any definition of that term, that they've warned that because of what's happening with the way this is being rolled out, that they may have to, some centers that they operate may have to close or reduce spaces. I mean, where do you see this going without some sort of change? Is there something the federal government can do, Amy, that you think can change the calculation? They say there's no more money, but so what can the feds do here?
I think that the federal government needs to put more pressure on the provinces, quite frankly, to put in their fair share of the funding. And it's really valuable for them to work together to find a solution because ultimately it's a crisis. We all want the Canada-wide early learning and childcare program to work. Right now, it's in a transition phase, and we know that there's going to be bumps along the road. But ultimately, I think both levels of government want it to work. They just need to find a way to work together.
Amy O'Neill, Executive Director of Treetop Children's Centre in Toronto. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, David. Thank you.